communications infrastructure. So we've got a fantastic panel here this afternoon. We're going to get some opening comments from the panel, and then if we've got some time, we'll take some questions from the audience too. So let me give you a quick introduction of everyone that we've got here. We've got Mr. Charles Cheng, the Managing Director of Huawei. We've got Mr. Nkobela Dayani, the General Director of the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies in South Africa. We've got Mr. Daryl Epstein, the Managing Director of Delta Scan. We've got Ms. Mtlatsi Molokome, the Head of Strategic Initiatives and Digital Integration of Sustainable Infrastructure Foundation of the Eastern European and Asian region, if I've got your entire title right there. And Mr. Dietlof Meyer, the CEO of Massive. So as you can see, this panel covers a broad swath of what could be considered anything to do with next generation digital communications infrastructure. But I do want to start, and I think we'll start in the same order that we did introductions, just to go through everyone in the room here. If we can just get a couple of comments on what your perspective of what the next generation of digital communications infrastructure looks like. And to that end, Charles, I think you're the perfect person to kick us off, given that you are in the business of all sorts of digital communications infrastructure. What does the future look like?
Hello. Yes, it's okay. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, our dear panelists. It's my honor to be here today and share and discuss the very important topic, next generation digital communication infrastructure. So I'm from Huawei. Currently, I'm a managing director at Huawei International. I will be the incoming deputy CEO of Huawei South Africa. So I've been spending my career in telecommunication and digitalization industry for more than 15 years. I think this is a very important topic because I think digital economy is a key factor to make the economy grows. And I think to boost the digital economy, two factors is very important. First one is infrastructure. Another one is the right people, the talent. And I think I always believe if you want to make something right, there should be collective effort from different domains. For example, government, like our industry business. So I'm very happy to discuss this in terms of policy perspective, and I would like to hear the wisdom from our panelists as well. Yeah, thank you.
Director General, let's move on to you. In terms of the future of digital communications and technologies in South Africa, what are your policy priorities at the moment?
Okay, good afternoon. So for us, I think our policies is that we have to ensure the agility. I think obviously the last time we put up a policy was a couple of years back, or a decade or so. And so we have to talk, and I think that has always been our stance, that it has to be technology neutral. It must promote investment, because obviously government, we do not roll out infrastructure in the main, and you have to make sure that it's the right policy that attracts the private sector investment. It must also promote the issue of innovation, so we have to look at it in terms of a futuristic policy and not necessarily looking at the here and now. We've also seen, I think in the last couple of years, that there has been a huge growth and development. No one is talking 3G anymore. Neither are they talking LTE, which was what was being said 4 years back. And now we've moved on to next generation, 5G, and even Wi-Fi 6, amongst others. So we have to make sure that there's that agility to it. And I think, so there are certain principles as well, I think, as government, in order to allow for new entrants. So you have to then have the open access principles also as core.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's not an enviable task you've got there, trying to put policy in place around technology that moves so much faster than any of the hands can move. They've got to move with all these processes that we have. But let's move on to you, Daryl. In terms of your perspective as the Managing Director of Delta Scan, what do you think about when you think about the future of digital communication technologies? What keeps you up at night?
Sure. So just a bit of background from where we come from. I'm a structural engineer, and when we talk digital, it's all about how do we change the way that we communicate information around managing infrastructure. Our company focuses on drones, artificial intelligence, and software, with a big component focusing on the cloud. The way that infrastructure is managed, or historically been managed, has been predominantly on paper. Paperwork, huge files, and they get lost. They're very difficult to manage. The same goes when you're sending email attachments. Things get lost along the way and they're not filed correctly. So when we approach infrastructure, firstly from a digital point of view or a tech point of view, we want to change the way that we capture the information using robotics, using digital-driven tools, to the way that we analyze the data using the latest advancements in software and communicating it via the cloud, which is accessible to anyone all around the world.
Fantastic. Moving on to Mapulane, I'm quite intrigued by your title. You talk about sustainable infrastructure that you're trying to build, right? And this is not something we often pair together, right? We talk about technology, we talk about progress, and often talk about it in terms of sustainability too. So I'm very curious to know a little bit more about your role that you're doing right there. And then also if you can tell us a bit about Source, which I think we're going to talk about a bit more today too.
No, that's perfectly fine. So I'm currently working with a digital platform that is intended to really break down the project lifecycle of infrastructure and assist you to do the preparatory work of building that from inception all the way to financial close and eventually monitoring and implementation. So that's what the platform does in itself. But what it also does is that on a sector-by-sector level, for example, whether it's energy or even digital infrastructure itself, it starts to embed international best practice. So for each stage of the project preparation development cycle, you consider, for example, the World Bank PPP guidelines, let's say if it's a PPP type thing, or the UN Sustainable Development Goals guidelines, and maybe incorporating that in your project development right from the outset. So just how you're preparing projects, no matter the sector, but here the focus is then digital infrastructure, and by the time you get to then considering whether the project is viable and whether it's bankable, the system would have guided you along the way. So that's essentially what it does, just in terms of that perspective. And then from a sustainability perspective, if you think about digital infrastructure in that way, if you look at places like Asia, where there's a big uptake, let's say, in internet usage, they have a big mobile network, mobile usage penetration there as well. So just expanding that infrastructure for better quality and etc., you kind of have to expand the network. But what that also means is that infrastructure has to be resilient, right? Consider disaster management or disaster response elements. So incorporating that in your project preparation and really focusing on what makes my infrastructure resilient long-term and in essence sustainable, then you are kind of incorporating the best principles of how to prepare and package a project, and then hopefully then it's viable and then it's bankable, and then we get to implementing it in that way.
Fantastic. And I'm going to ask you one more question, if you don't mind. Who are you working with at the moment? Is it governments? Is it the private sector? Is it across both?
Right, so the system is intended to empower government agencies, government departments that work in the infrastructure ecosystem. However, if you find yourself in a situation where, let's say it's a PPP, so you've got both private sector and the public sector, it will assist the consolidation of efforts into a single repository from a digital systems perspective, and assist the coordination that's appropriate in kind of moving through the process of project preparation and development with greater ease, it's intended to, and hopefully faster. Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll definitely come back to you there. But let's move on to Detlef. Talk to me about how your company, Massive, is essentially approaching the challenges around digital communication, and in South Africa in particular. Let's try bring the conversation back to the room.
So yes, I think, for me, digital infrastructure communication is linked to connectivity. I think that's critical, and we touched on it. I mean, we're seeing the new technologies coming in. So we're moving towards a 5G, but we're also sitting in Africa with weak infrastructure. You're sitting with weak incumbents, and you're sitting with an infrastructure that has to obviously improve. And what we do is we actually connect fiber to homes, fiber to businesses, and then fiber to towers to actually enable technologies to evolve, to get to 6G in time. And we got this amazing challenge because we got 16 million homes in South Africa, And if you look at the throughputs and the data requirements that the world needs today for people to communicate and stay in touch, we're a little bit left behind as a continent at this point, you know. And what we believe is in 2030, if we can't get a connected South Africa, a fiber-connected South Africa, or in Africa, we will be left behind. Because if you look at what's happening on digital transformation and what's happening on throughputs and data, how people are studying, how they do business, how they compete with the rest of the world, it's all linked to connectivity. And to have those specific throughputs that you need to use 400 gigs in a house, you know, you need a very, very structured, connected Africa. And I think that's our core business, to say, listen, how do we connect 16 million homes in South Africa as quickly as possible?
And how do you do that? I mean, push
Listen,
one
we've put 31 billion rands of infrastructure into the ground. So if you look at it today, you know, we started in, like everything, you start in more the higher LSM areas, but that's not the people that need it. You know, you have to get into the real lower LSM areas, you know, and that's where the masses sit, and that's where the people sit that actually need this technology, because they have to study differently, they have to communicate better, and they have to teach themselves to communicate, to compete with the rest of the world differently. So basically, it's a race at pace against time, with huge capital investments behind it. And that's where I say, you know, we need private sector, we need the government working very, very closely with government to actually get this done, you know, but it's very capital intensive. You need very strong shareholders, and you need a government that supports you to get to the goals.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to Charles there, and then I'd also like to get a comment from Daryl also on the same question. Like, policymakers obviously work with scarcity. You're dealing with scarce resources. You've got to deploy them somewhere, and if something gets spent, that rand can't get spent somewhere else. So from your perspective, what advice would you give policymakers who want to leapfrog into the digital future? Where is the best investment to be made? Where should they start? And I'm sure you're going to completely objectively, not in terms of your particular companies, but I know you have the expertise, and I know you know what those answers are.
So we are talking about government grants, is it? Yeah. Okay. This is a very, I guess I must answer this very carefully. I think I'm new here, but I know this African last year here, and I think your DCDT have announced that they will focus on universal and widely coverage for the broadband for everyone in South Africa. If you're talking about government grants, in my personal opinion, I think I think government policymakers should consider two areas to spend their money. First one is rural coverage. Yeah, rural coverage. I think where there's in the city area with in the town, I think with operators, partners, local SMEs, vendors like us, we are able to make the business case and able to provide the service to the industry, public sectors, consumers. But where the remote area, where they are lacking of basic infrastructures, I think because all the enterprise have to make some profit to make them sustainable. So if government not step in, give grants, build the basic infrastructure, there was no development at all in those remote areas. I think what I've been reading here in the past few days, I think the department has, the ministerial department already have the policy and the focus on this. I think this will help a lot in terms of digital economies. Secondly, probably on innovations, where there's, for example, I think everybody are talking about AI and big data, those things. I've been working in Singapore in the past 4 years. You know, there's about 7 to 9% of the electricity is consumed by the data center in that small islands. And there's a lot of AI innovation going on, like big models, LLMs, all those things. I guess if there's an additional budget, I think government should put some innovation, leading some innovation projects, and then bring the competitiveness of the country into next level. This is my personal opinion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Daryl, over to you. Same question.
Cool. So I'm going to approach it from the built environment side, not so much from communications, because that's not my field. When we look at the built environment, existing infrastructure around us, so the biggest topic I think that I hear discussed today is around new projects. What are we building? What are we creating? And there's very little focus on maintenance. Now, a lot of the global giants, Singapore being probably one of the leaders in the space, they aim to digitize all the existing, because once you digitize and you know what's there, you have a record of what's there, from the buildings to Paris, they're digitizing the entire underground sewer network. In Norway, they're digitizing every single bridge within 5 years. So a focus on creating records of what is existing, what is the condition also of the existing, that will prevent all these failures we see that we get to, unfortunately, have to interact with on a daily basis. It's a reactive approach to looking at the quality and the condition of infrastructure rather than proactive.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go to Mapulane then, because I think you've picked up on something that touches on her domain of expertise, and that is in terms of obviously the sustainability question. So I'm going to ask you a very similar but slightly different question, and that is, what are the sorts of things that perhaps don't have the longevity that we're looking for, things that end up costing us more than what they're going to give us in the long run? So another way to put that is like, where are societies in general, from what you've seen, we don't have to speak about South Africa specifically, where are they perhaps chasing the new and the noisy as opposed to the really deep infrastructure that is required for long-term return on investment from a societal level?
All right, so if I look at, for example, the different regions, so this is where you'd probably start, just to consider the fact that different regions have they're at a different stage of development.
Yeah.
Right? So if you think of, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, and you look at the projected needs or projected demand in terms of, for example, there's an increased need for online education, e-commerce, let's say even to the extent telemed, right? So when you're looking, in those particular areas, and the fact that a lot of that is dispositioned in rural type geographies, so you kind of have to then still put the new and lay that down. So that's still going to be new to that extent.
Yeah.
And remember, you're suffering from the historic element of not enough laid telecommunications lines. So you inherently have to consider, okay, how do you newly kind of innovate to keep up with the demand as of now, right? So that would be, for example, your SSA type regions. And then you have the policy elements that support that. For example, we have your SA Connects in South Africa that was to really include that access to that digital access more broadly in South Africa. And Rwanda, I've seen they have a Smart Kigali where they're trying to implement a similar thing. So basically new. So when you consider, for example, a place like Eastern Europe, right, they're quite developed, their infrastructure is quite robust already. They're looking at bringing in, for example, your advanced technology adoption. Internet of Things, smart city, for them, that is more, it rolls out off the tongue more easily. So they would also jump to more quicker things, but in essence, to some extent, sometimes also neglect the infrastructure that exists in that sense. So sometimes it being more costly down the line to say, oh, we have to go back and repair stuff. We're already jumping into how do we kind of bring in this advanced technology adoption. So not finding the right balance sometimes, I think, you could find that emerging just looking at the differences of the regions and how they apply themselves. But I think increasingly people are thinking around it, especially because financiers are asking the question more and more around, okay, so show me how this is sustainable and show me how this is resilient going forward. So it's forcing the implementing agents and the people in the ecosystem to think a bit deeper in that particular context.
Yeah, let me go back to you, Director General. Like I've sat in a few of these panel sessions today, and there's a lot of conversation in almost all the rooms about public-private partnerships and collaboration, making sure everyone's talking together. Yeah. And quite often, these conversations get to the point where the private sector has like a wish list for government. But I wanted to kind of turn that around and say, from your perspective, what is it that you would like corporates in the digital infrastructure space to be supporting your goals more?
Sure. And I think probably I'd like to link it to the question that you posed earlier. I mean, our biggest concern as government is that we want to equalize society.
Yeah.
So the issue of accessibility is very key, you know, so everyone should have equal access to the same digital infrastructure, irrespective of where you're at in our country. So to do that, and I think there's a couple of issues. There's the devices in terms of the end means. And unfortunately, obviously, with technology, again, it continuously evolves. But because we want to ensure a digital society, an inclusive digital society, we want to make sure that every single citizen has got a smart device. Currently, 60% of the consumers don't. So we have to then look in terms of a partnership in as far as to bring in that, because that will also assist with the digital literacy, etc. The second issue, as I said, for us is also part of that, ensuring that the rural and the underserved areas are also connected. And I think we've done well. Maritza just mentioned the SA Connect. I mean, that's a collaboration between government and the private sector. And it's the first of its kind. So far, it's working very well. And I also take pride on the fact that in this particular model, which is a 3-tier, so you've got your traditional mobile operators, but we've also introduced your ISPs and wireless access internet service providers in the ecosystem, as well as SMMEs who have been previously marginalized, or we have not brought them into the center stage in terms of the roundtable participation. And then obviously we have then SIDSSA connecting or existing government sites. So there's a level in terms of what government plays and what then the private sector does. And I think an equally same model going into the future will assist, because what then happens, as I think Defoe indicated, private sector can then say, we will go into the areas where it's economically viable, and then we can then supplement that in terms of complementing and going into the underserved and rural areas and look at the incentive issue. And that probably talks to the issue of how do we then contribute to a common fund and everybody be able to tap into that. The most important thing, lastly, is that we have to also harness in terms of innovation. That's the next level that we have not really paid much attention to. So you've got people coming up with solutions in terms of AI, how then to manage the issues of data, because data and security are going to be very key in the era that we're in. And so people are coming up with softer solutions, because that's more applicable in terms of the South African market as well as the regional market. We have to then bring them in. And government as well as private sector will have to take that risk leap in as far as investing in that innovation.
Absolutely, and it's such a critical point, of course, this idea of digital inclusion and the digital divide, which can be looked at in two different ways. There's the internal divide, but there's also the global competitiveness divide. And that's why Detlef and Mapulane, I'd like your perspective on the internal divide and your views around how we can get better digital inclusion within our own societies here in South Africa. So let's start with you, Detlef, and then we'll move over to you.
Yes, I think, listen, I think it's quite clear and everybody understands exactly what that digital divide is in South Africa. And it's exactly what the DG was saying. You know, you immediately go to the high LSMs, and everybody with a bit of money would go and invest in places where there's a big return, okay, low density but big return. Also, your cost to deploy in areas, if you roll out fiber in these areas, it's double what the cost is in more the dense areas. But you know, we did exactly that. You know, so there's 2.2 million homes in the high LSM areas. There's basically 4.8 million homes in the I call it the lower LSM areas, which is your Mitchells Plains, your Vosloorus's, your Soshanguves, your Sowetos, and then you get the Khayelitsha's and the Alexes of the world, which is basically 9 million homes in those areas, or dwellings in those areas. And the challenge is, how do you create and how do you close that digital divide? And what a lot of people get wrong is they actually think the need in a Khayelitsha or Alex or a Mitchell's is different to a need in Camps Bay or Sandton or Parkhurst, where we started actually. And weird enough, what we picked up is that your need is actually twice as much on those areas if you just look at data throughput. So a house in Mitchell's Plain uses 400 gigs a month of data, where in Parkhurst or Sandton it's just over 200 gigs. So it's like double that. And if you want to close that digital divide, you have to make it economically feasible to actually roll out in those areas. And we thought it was super impossible to do it, and then we tested Mitchell's, and Mitchell's worked perfectly. And today we got 1 million homes in the high LSM areas, and we got 1 million homes in the low LSM areas. And we're building now at scale in Khayelitsha and in Alex, but we're still far off the 16 million homes. And that's where I believe the DG touched on it. There's this piggybacking or countering where we can actually support one another in giving the different technologies into these areas, closing this divide. And yes, the mobile operators are doing it. Yes, we got Wi-Fi providers and public Wi-Fi supporting it. But at the end of the day, this will evolve into a quality service. It has to be a quality service, and that means throughput, uncapped, meaning no limitations, and data in abundance, and open access. And I think that's the challenge, is to say, listen, how do we create these economics of people developing from within a Vosloo, within a Soshanguve, create this economies of scale where businesses can start their own little ISPs, different ways maybe, but they create their own little ISPs in these areas, and not chuck the national ISPs into the areas. So for me, listen, we have to create the connectivity. We have to focus on the low LSM and the super low LSM, because that's where you close it. You don't close it from the top down. You have to do it differently.
I'm listening to you speak there, and you're really talking about like a time preference problem there, because corporate shareholders are not necessarily as patient in seeing the return on that investment as perhaps public sector stakeholders should be, because this is a long-term play. It's much almost like the issues around education and healthcare. You do a lot of investment now, but you only see that return in 20 years' time, and if you don't make that investment, you're just always continually behind.
Exactly.
So bridging that time preference problem is definitely where the public and private sector have to work together, because the state has the luxury of a bit more patience, but how do you actually pull that together?
And I think you're 100% right. But the focus is quality, and I think we got there. It's really,
and it's the same quality for everyone.
You will never sort the handset penetration issue out in Africa. You can just go look at it. I mean, the 3G, 4G penetration on handsets is still not there, really. You look at 5G, paying 30,000, 40,000 rand for a handset. It's going to be, it's a barrier of entry, But what you can do is, where you got safety concerns in a place like a Mitchell's, for instance, there's families in the home, you create the entertainment, you create a platform where people can study, you watch TV, you do streaming. It covers a lot of the spheres that we're trying to solve, and that's security, education, and communication, But listen, it's capital intensive. You need partnerships, and I really think, I just take an example of the Wayleaf scenario, where the government changed the way we got access to Wayleafs to build these fiber networks. And they changed it, and suddenly it became, just where it was a super barrier, it became a plus for us, But it was just a few policy changes, a little bit of focus, and suddenly we enabled people to start rolling out. And now what we're seeing is, where it was impossible to roll out into the low LSM areas, today it's actually super possible. But 2-3 years ago, it was impossible. We just couldn't think of it. And now we've got 1 million homes covered with fiber, direct fiber into those homes, which I think is a very big plus for us as a country.
Absolutely. It takes communication across all the divides, making partnerships out of what were previously perhaps slightly adversarial relationships. But Latsi, over to you. How do you, in your role in your company, how do you approach the challenge of digital inclusion?
All right. So if I consider, for example, how, in my view, you could really start leveraging, and I think they touched on it, AI and really data analytics, and you look at that. If you start really analyzing your user behaviors, which is what you started referring to, patterns of economic activity, you start to look at, proactive responses to the demand on the networks, right? So if you consider that, and then you also layer that on other built environment elements, right? My view is that when you don't look at digital communication and infrastructure as a silo on its own and see how it can then best integrate to other elements of service delivery, whether it's actual infrastructure, looking at how best, for example, if you had to do your load reduction and etc., you look at, okay, what is actually optimal for the economy to continue to thrive in terms of timing, right? Looking and analyzing that data. For me, that bridging that divide where you understand the urban areas more but less how, and you make assumptions about, let's say, the less urbanized or where you don't actually have access to that type of data to really observe that. You know, your responses in terms of service delivery, the type of infrastructure that you're rolling out that is suitable for that area, for the patterns that you're meant to observe. Once you separate the two, and I think that speaks to now next-gen infrastructure, not only digital, but once you separate the two, I think you're not leveraging on the power that could be harnessed there. And that, for me, will start addressing, you know, accessibility, inclusivity, affordability, and start then forcing us to be more innovative, right, around solving for real data-driven issues that is facilitated for us to observe using digital communications and technology. And then if you layer all of that together, I think you start having solutions that really are integrated and start making sense for the populations we're looking to serve. So in essence, what I'm saying is that the digital inclusion, I think it shouldn't be limited only to who has access to internet and etc., right? It's how do we use this to improve the quality of life of our citizens, whether you're in the urban area understanding how they operate or whether less observed, maybe more rural. But starting to look at that as for future. Well, that's my view.
Well, exactly. It's got to be holistic, right? It's not just siloed. And I think we just hear that coming through so many of these conversations here today. But I want to zoom out just a little bit, and we'll go again to Daryl and Charles, because you have very different perspectives, but I think you both have views on the topic. And that is of global competitiveness, closing the international digital divide, right? So instead of talking about the rich and poor within our borders, talk about how can we make South Africa more globally competitive? And you can answer this question either in terms of what we're lacking, or in terms of the threat or the problem, or in terms of the opportunity as you see it to become more competitive. And this is something I'm so curious about at the moment in my personal life, professional life, and I'm sure everyone here is interested too. So Daryl, maybe let's start with you.
Sure. So we operate on 3 continents, around 10 countries at the moment, and the main theme that we see all over is this push for digital inclusion in government, as well as private, and all the way down to the lower economy sectors. One of the biggest reasons is when it comes to maintenance, again, from an engineering point of view, we need to know what's there. Now, bringing it back to South Africa, having responded to numerous failures or disasters from the young boy that fell into a sewer in Soweto, we headed up that search and rescue, the collapse of the tailings dam, Jagersfontein, we headed up the forensics for Kusile, Medupi, the Bree Street explosion recently, and a lot of that is we don't know what's there. We don't know what our infrastructure looks like. Maintenance hasn't been a big focus. It's always, you know, we'll deal with it when it breaks kind of philosophy, and that's throughout Africa. It's not a South African specific mindset. And what we see, I mean, especially through infrastructure South Africa, is there is a change in mindset that's taking shape. I mean, it was spoken about in panels today that there is now that focus to move into digital. I think the biggest reason we haven't in the past is fear. It's new. From an infrastructure point of view or from an engineering point of view, we have this concept of if it worked, you know, last year or a decade ago, surely it should work now. And with that kind of a mindset, we've fallen behind. Many other industries, you know, we're speaking about telecom, cellular infrastructure, they've embraced a lot of digital transformation, but around the built environment, actual physical assets, you know, structures and buildings and bridges. In Gauteng alone, I think the statistics is 92% of our bridges are structurally deficient with potential for collapse. And the only way to change that is proactive maintenance. It's proactive digitization, from creating those as-built to creating records of what's there and putting in digital strategies around the maintenance and the planning and the monitoring in the future as well.
Absolutely. Charles, your view on international competitiveness. How could South Africa compete? Where are we falling behind, and what could we be getting right?
Okay, this is my second trip to South Africa. So it will be a very difficult question for me, because I always believe I don't have enough time to down to earth to realize, to see the root cause, what can help South Africa's country to be better. But yeah, so, but in terms of, generally speaking, I think if you talk about competitiveness between countries, I think infrastructure is very important, good policy is very important. Maybe we can add a little bit more effort in talent development, because in my short time here, I think we, in my company, South Africa, we're always trying to hire more local employee, more local employee, because, yeah, but the process is a bit slow. It's a bit slow. We are doing quite okay, but compared to compared to our target, I think there's still a little bit gap. So there's not enough. I would say not enough. There's a challenge in terms of talent supply. That's why we work with DCDT and other ministries to provide training program to use in the past few years. And there's a few thousand have been graduated. I believe in long run they play a very important role in the ecosystem. Yeah, I think that's my sharing. Yeah. Hope maybe next year I have the chance to join this panel again. I have some more more findings.
Perspective is often the most interesting, because we're so close to the problems and to the challenges. Which is actually why I want to come back to you, Director General, to another one of those really problems that you find yourself in the center of, and that is that most of the conversation we've had so far has been around things like digital inclusion, getting the basics right, like literally just getting internet to people who don't have it. But at the same time, much like corporates have the same sort of problems, this problem with self-disruption, having to deal with your day-to-day business, pay the salaries, but also at the same time having to think ahead about how you're going to be competitive in the future. And I wanted to know your perspective in terms of the more strategic approach to digital communications being looked at by policymakers in our country at the moment. I mean, when we look at places like Estonia or Singapore, even China, they have these longer-term plans of becoming excellent in certain areas. There's like a strategic, future-orientated plan. And of course, we've got many problems we need to solve in the present. But I'm very curious about your department's approach to the future and future excellence.
Yeah, so definitely we are working, and I mean this time around, as you said, because ICTs or the digital infrastructure is part of the overall infrastructure plan. So the infrastructure plan 2050 vision is there. But I want to just quickly come back because I want to link it. You know, so Huawei, we signed a cooperative agreement in 2015. And we established one of those was an innovation center. So what he talked about, the ICT talent and R&D, I think in South Africa we do have. If you step out here, if you just walk up to the beachfront or to the waterfront, we've also got the Cape Silicon. So talent is not necessarily lacking. The bigger challenge is how do we commercialize it, and how do we harness it, and how do we take it across the border. In the department, every single time we participate in international competitions, we always come back winning. You know, so that's the recognition in as far as then the talent. So you've got, in as far as what we have a Digitech app, and then one of the ladies, we went to India, and I mean, you would expect it was part of the G20. So amongst the G20 member countries, we came back with the most innovative solution, because we took it in terms of application, environment, and how then it can massify. So we talked about how do you do online breast assessment. And that is now the technology that India is trying to draw from us. So apart from the commercialization, harnessing, as well as promoting it, we also need to make sure that we protect South Africa's IP. Most instances, we export it. And maybe that's been the fact that as South Africans, we don't necessarily invest as much for us, and then we take it out. In terms of drones, everyone is talking about the innovation in as far as what Rwanda and Kenya are doing, but that has been part of the South African solution in as far as, how do we make sure that we build the drones technology. And there are many others, whether you're looking in the areas of AI, etc. So our universities as well as research hubs, they are doing their part. I think what is probably most important now is to bring in both private sector investment as well as even private sector, the industries, to actually take up the solutions that we're coming up with. So app development is certainly one area in terms of skills. And that's the next in terms of tying into your question to then say, we're actually working now with the new procurement bill. Hopefully that will be passed. We're then saying that we should look at up to 30% set aside for innovation to actually take that risk in terms of investing in innovation. And those are the solutions that we want to have, whether you're looking in terms of the IoT for agriculture, if you're looking in terms of drones for mining and other areas where not only just in terms of the disaster, but just to assess the infrastructure, because I think that's very key. It will assist us in terms of assessing the maintenance of the infrastructure. Or if then you're going to look at even artificial intelligence in as far as making sure that we are also business sensitive as well as business conscious in as far as what the market needs are, the assessment, and then be able to draw up the data from it.
Yeah, I love what you say there. I did a little bit of work with the CSIR last year, and I was just astonished at the incredible research and development that is being state-sponsored at the moment, but also kind of disappointed at the complete gap. Like, there's so few people in the private sector that know how our taxes have been spent so well and what we're doing to commercialize that, to turn that into return on investment for our whole society, right? So there's so much happening, but it's about sort of connecting those dots and getting everyone pulling in the same direction. But I do want to take a few questions from the floor. If anyone's got any questions or comments, I think we've got about half an hour left now. Is there anyone here that would like to put anything to our panel? Otherwise, I've got plenty more questions. Okay.
That was quick. Hi. Thank you for the opportunity. One of your panelists spoke about, the device issues and that it still remains a problem. I assume he means from an affordability point of view. Do you perhaps have any thoughts on how we could address improving access to devices?
I think that was to you.
Yeah, I think, listen, to be honest, I think it's going to be a problem. If you look at the costs, and I worked 6 years in Congo, and I worked 5 years in Tanzania and Africa, and for Vodacom then. But device penetration the latest device penetration was always an issue, because it's a very costly thing, and you can't get the latest devices at prices that just make sense, But what I do think is if you create a type of a scenario where you get fixed wireless into homes, you create hotspots, you get throughputs at unlimited speeds or speeds that's actually faster than a 5G, I really think in a lot of areas you can actually get around the device issue. But that's saying that you have to obviously then get data in abundance, type of uncapped, and you have to have speeds that make sense, and it should be super affordable for the house. And I think that's what you're seeing, is if you can create fixed wireless access points and fiber points, the type of scenarios, or fiber to the home scenarios in areas, the whole family can have access to the data, and that changes the whole dynamic. Yes, the mobility of it still will be a problem, but I think if you look at it, even what's happening at this point, we're seeing call centers being built in Mitchell's Plain at this point. So people don't have to travel anymore. They're very close to basically where they work. And I've done lots of surveys when I was in Eastern Europe as well on connectivity. And people would, we did surveys with people, and you would say, listen, but why do you need mobile? Why do you need Vodafone 5G? If you're in a train, you've got Wi-Fi. If you're in a restaurant, you've got Wi-Fi. If you At your office, you've got Wi-Fi. And basically what it does is it creates a mechanism to close the gap. You want to be always connected. I think that's the critical thing. And the challenge is, I think there are mechanisms in developing and emerging markets to get around it a little bit, but it needs a different focus and it needs different solutions, which might not be just getting the handset cost down. You know, that will be a little bit of a barrier of entry for us at this point, and I think it will remain for a little bit going into the future. But there are solutions to get around that.
Can we maybe get a view from Charles on that too, on the future of affordable devices, if you've got any insights there?
Yeah, I think I really like the word affordable. So I think if you talk about these issues, because I understand there's certain population that cannot afford smartphones or 4G, 5G phones. I have a discussion with my colleagues because Huawei have a different business group. Although I don't sit in on any business group, we have consumer business, we have ICT business. Huawei consumer always identify them as a premium brand, so we are focusing on like $300 and above phones. But our other BGs, so like me, myself, and the other BG colleagues are trying to help push for cheaper phones in South Africa market. Yeah, I think my ideology is I talk to my colleagues in consumer market. They will never be your customer if you don't let them to have a phone first. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
it's a great way to put it.
yeah. So today this young man can afford only maybe 500 rands phone, but if you provide the infrastructures, provide the opportunities, maybe when he getting older, like in his 30s, his affordable point is about become $500. Yeah. So my point is this is a collaborative effort. I think industry also realizes these problems, and the 5G technology is more mature. I think there could be a cheaper 5G smartphone in the market this year. I heard the analysis price of less than $100. Yeah. So there's the industry working on it. Maybe from the policymakers. I think DG is aware of this year. Well, maybe you can have some scheme as well. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, my point is you have to cultivate the user first, give them opportunity, then the market will grow and the issue will be solved. Yeah.
That's a great way of looking at it. You've got to plant the seed now to reap it in the future, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, if I may just come in on that one. So we've also been looking at this, and it's very key in terms of the next generation spectrum policy. We intending to shut down 3G services in South Africa by 2027. Wow. So whilst we are trying to stimulate local market, but we're also looking at other incentives to then make sure that the consumer has an affordable smart devices in their hands. I mean, when I talk about talent in South Africa, we actually do have local production of these smart devices. I wouldn't want to mention them, but if you go to PEP, I can say if you go to PEP or Ackermans, I mean, they're like the highest drivers and in high demand. So we've seen their manufacturing plant in Midrand, and what I like about it is that they actually employed young South African females. So 80% of their employment is young South African females, creating jobs. So if we can then attract others to actually say, set up in a manufacturing plant in South Africa, technology, or especially digital technology, it's borderless. So when South Africa catches whatever flu or the latest craze, it's going to cross our borders. It's going to go into Lesotho. It's going to then transcend into Swaziland, Mozambique, Malawi, etc., and the rest of the continent is going to. So you have to look at it, whoever's looking from an investment perspective, not in terms of a 62 million population, but you must look at it from a 1.2 billion potential business. So.
Amazing. It's such an opportunity. We've got a question over here at the front, and then we've got one on the side there. We've got plenty now.
Normally, policy focus on national development, government national development. I see, you rightly said, in that area, it normally focus on liberalization of the sector, creating job opportunity, equal access. But the aspect of universal access, I don't know how the South African government look at it, but normally this giant in the sector focus on area of interest where they normally make business. So whether they contribute towards the universal access fund, that's a question that I want to find out. I have come from Liberia. We have a universal access program where all of the operators and major ISP provider contribute towards the fund to assist government to cover area where they don't have the market, unserved area. So that's a question that I wanted to ask, whether in South Africa it happened. I'm Sekou Kruman, the Minister for Post and Telecommunication from Liberia. Thank you.
Okay. Who's that addressed to?
Probably.
I think to yourself.
Okay,
You're probably the best
yeah.
position to answer.
So yes, we also do have a universal service fund. In fact, we're in the process of transforming that fund, because what we want to do is not just to invest in terms of the underserved areas or for the expansion of the network, but we're also saying that we want to transform it to a digital development. So the digital development says that we must also invest in innovation. So a portion of that fund is actually going to take that risk in as far as making sure that we assist the innovative solutions and take them to commercialization, as well as whatever the other incentives that we have. And then also, obviously, this day and age, we want, sorry, I thought we were going to talk about the fiber to the home. That's one of the key policy drives or targets that we have by 2030. So for us to ensure that, we also then need to make sure that each household has then the necessary devices for that. But in the areas where, as I said, it's non-commercially viable, we can also tap into that fund. So later on, we'll have to then look at how do we make sure that other people are able to contribute to the fund and not necessarily just the operators. So we are working on that review.
Thank you very much. We had a question on this side.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Comfort Matoti from Infrastructure South Africa. Just two questions, DG. At SIDSSA, we're working on the urban and rural divide, and one of the things that we have identified is that digital communication is one of the most unequal sectors. And I hear that you are speaking of the 2050 plan. So I just want to ask, does your policy, or did your policy draw deeper into what are the effects of this divide in as far as digital communication is concerned, and how is it planning to attend to it? Is it going to be on gradual phases, or it's going to be on integrating phases? And also, how is it also planning to maintain it in the future? Yeah. And considering that maybe you might have a challenge on capacity, how is it working on it? Sure. Second question, Microsoft was done not so long ago. And I'm really interested that what lessons, it can be corridors questions, it can be something that probably in your department is going to be discussed in the next few meetings, but what lessons have been learned there, especially from a government perspective, and considering that when the Microsoft was down, I'm definitely sure there were certain things which are really important that were affected. So in terms of that maintenance and that stability and that sustainability, what are the corridor questions and corridor conversations that you are having, or maybe from a DG perspective, you are willing to propose to prevent or hinder that in the future? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. So the first question, very quickly, you know, we had licensees or operators licensed, but what we didn't do was to impose social obligations on them. We've now rectified that with the last auctioning of the spectrum, that we've imposed those social obligations that says you have to go into the rural and underserved areas. You must have a certain threshold in terms of connecting government institutions, and they've started with that rollout now. And we're being deliberate to then say, you're going to start in the underserved areas and move into the rural areas. And we've also said to them, you are most welcome to have a technology partner. So your SMMEs, if you think for you can't go there. And that's why we also have our policy says technology neutral. So whatever that you want to, if you want to talk about Wi-Fi, you want to talk about satellite in that particular area instead of actually laying down fiber, we're not prescriptive. So I think but then over and above that, as I said, the SA Connect also looks at even the non-licensees to bring them into the ecosystem, and then using the BBI, which is the State Digital Infrastructure Company, one of the two, to then become the backhaul, and then they will do the last mile. So those are then the interventions that we've come up with. Now, on the last question with regards, it wasn't just Microsoft, by the way. I've got a whole list here, and I think he was also affected. But what a couple of years back, and I was saying this, I think last week, we were intentional, both as South Africa, obviously spearheaded by South Africa, and other African countries, to actually say we need to invest in submarine cables. So the issue of infrastructure, back then that we should be enabled with one submarine cable, which was in the West Coast, and that back then it wasn't even WAX, before WAX, I've even forgotten, SET3 or something. And we were deliberate to then say, actually, we must invest in more of the submarine cables. South Africa has always got a strategic advantage on the fact that we've got the West as well as the East Coast. So with the 9 cables that are circling us, we were actually then able to switch on. So the whole idea of a proper, meaningful digital infrastructure, where it's your submarine cable, it's your satellite, yes, terrestrial within. So if it was down on the west, we then quickly jumped to the east. So that disturbance, we didn't have a complete blackout as a country because of those policy decisions that we took. And we're looking forward then to the next cable that's coming up as well, because, data is now the new, it's a high demand. And the traffic, obviously, South Africa is rated number 10 globally in terms of internet traffic. And so that just tells you how much we're consuming. And the mere fact that we're seeing more investment in terms of your submarine cables is then showing that intent that there's definitely even more drive. You give people, you connect more households, you connect more citizens, they have smartphones, it's definitely going to triple.
Fantastic. We've got a question over here. And if anyone else has got a question, just raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you.
Oh, thank you very much. I had noted a comment regarding reference to Estonia. And that's one of the areas it's mostly referred to. But if you look at the population there, it's 1.3 as compared to 65 million of South Africa that we still need to cover with the infrastructure. I think we still have a lot of work to do as a country, but we must appreciate the land mass and the population. I think secondly, we need to appreciate the effort that the Department of Communication has put in with regards to SA Connect, and there's other projects like broadband access funds that are really getting down to the actual rural areas, the townships. And at that, I think we really need to appreciate the current administration in that department. But my question here, and I think the first 2 guys on the left, next to you, they can respond to it. There's a debate. In fact, it's also including the infrastructure SA guys and the DBSA guy. When it comes to the actual network infrastructure, your towers, your fiber, and all that stuff, who really needs to own that infrastructure? Is government the right people to own the infrastructure, own the investment? Is private sector? We just need to balance the debate. I can safely tell you that the current argument is balance. Others have said if government is invested, we must own the infrastructure, because after the 10-year period of services, of all the NRCs that government has paid the capex investment, we still need to go out again and reinvest. Others are saying, no, focus on services. That's where you guys, we must look at. I think if we can strike that balance, because that's the discussion, if we look at it currently, it makes it difficult for some of these projects to be bankable because of that little gray line. Thank you.
Maybe start with you, Mapulane, and then move on to Deedlif.
Right, so I've always noted that when it comes to assets, when you have a vested interest in that asset, your incentive to look after it and ensure that it's operating at its most optimal and perhaps even extend its useful life extends. So if you're saying to me that, you know, you have this infrastructure and government does not have a vested interest in it, right? It's just kind of, you know, you'll just use it for what it's worth and then kind of move along and then the next round and then you'll see what you do at that particular point. So I think it's good practice to incentivize, you know, how you approach that infrastructure and how you plan for it and maintain it going forward if there is a vested interest from both sides, because you're benefiting collectively in that sense, whether it's the citizens, whether it's the businesses that require that infrastructure to be there, but certainly as government in kind of fulfilling its obligations from a country perspective. So I believe there should be vested interest on all sides, yeah.
Detlef?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer. Yeah, but I think we must go look at the world. I think if you look at digital, I think if you look at the evolution of digital, the complexity of it, where it's going, you know, the difficulty of maintaining it, the capex intensity that you put into the networks. You can look at the MNOs. I mean, the MNOs are spending each. I mean, you look at Vodacom, MTN, each 10, 15 billion a year just to maintain their stuff. And it's not just throwing money into it, maintaining and building sites. It's super, super complicated. I was 23 years in mobile industry. I don't think there's a more complicated industry in the world because it's changing so quickly. So yes, I think there's pockets of the spectrum that we auctioned. And I think that was one of the fundamental things we did, is we auctioned the spectrums, you know, in the right way. So who owns the spectrum? The government owns the spectrum, you know. And yes, there's that interlinking, but leave the experts to do what the experts are good at. And because it's evolving so quickly, and it's super dynamic. And it's, you know, when we talk fiber, you can think, and I can remember when I started in the fiber company, after the first 3 months, I said to my wife, gee, this is quite a simple business, we're just digging. But I'm telling you, in the last 5, 6 years, the complexity of what came on top of the fiber, with all the solutions we had to create to drive it down and deeper down into the different LSMs, it is super complicated. And remember, I'm not in the service layer even. I've got the ISPs on top of us as well on open access. And I'm just saying, back to the CCOM cables, there's so much data coming into Africa and into South Africa from the C cables. We need the veins to actually take that out into the different areas, and that has to end up in a house or into an endpoint, which is a business. So it's so complicated. It looks simple, and I think yes, long haul is a bit different to maybe a fiber home in a fiber network or a mesh network in metros. But I think there's a balance. You know, and I think if you can get that balance to work better, then you achieve much more. We must remember we have to connect 16 million homes, which is the 60 million people, and it's not just connecting it; it's maintaining it to a level where your throughputs can be world class, so you can make sure we close the international digital divide. If we don't do it, the world will run away from us, because the exponential growth that's happening currently in the world is phenomenal. If we don't close this on connectivity, we will be much, much further behind. But I think we are, and I think the focus is there. Time, like I say, we're running against the clock at this point. but I think we are very aligned. It's just how do we position it. And I want to add one thing more. You know, a lot of the European countries built their digital and communication from an incumbent, like a BT or a so the issue is South Africa really did the communication. I'm talking from a digital point of view, from the mobile operators, because the mobile operators were far ahead. In the where I started at Vodacom in 1994, and when we started building that the networks, we were far ahead of the world on coverage. We had full coverage across the country, even in a car. Nowhere in the world you could have that. The challenge is we stayed behind a little bit, because what we had to do is we had to have an incumbent that could do the digital, the fixed infrastructure. And we're catching up a little bit on that. But for me, there's a dual play in this. Very, very close relations working with with the government's fast decisions, especially from an investment point of view. You know, we're sitting with some investment decisions that takes 3 years. If it takes 3 years, you don't deploy for 3 years. You know? So it's very critical that we drive a climate where people will invest, because it's so capital intensive. It's very capital intensive. So it's a dual answer to your question. Sorry.
That old adage that says the future's here is just unequally distributed applies to South Africa like nowhere else on the planet, right?
So that's, you know, you have to find the right balance. I think obviously as a country, we have our own policy imperatives that we're trying to advance.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to then ask Huawei in terms of China, I mean, they're a socialist country. So public investment is going to be key. But for us, I think, as you said, that we just have to make sure, precisely from a level of sustainability, it's important that you have then you bring in the private sector. Now, private sector, I think the question people always focusing in terms of government, the private sector also needs to be defined.
Yes.
Private sector can mean your ISP, private sector means your SMME, private sector means, you know, the established multinationals, etc. So all of three, you know, they're all defined in terms of scope. And what is also important is to then address or mitigate the risk that are there, because most people, why they don't necessarily think government should not be in the business of infrastructure rollout or owning infrastructure, is because, as you said, we have not maintained the infrastructure. Obviously, funding gets diverted to, so we've got so many priorities as a country, etc. But if you then come up with a model that complements, as you said, the triple PE, public-private partnership, this seems to be working under the SA Connect, you are definitely going to get that. Why, I think as government you want to, as we probably case being made, there are areas where it's been non-viable, commercially viable. People are thinking in terms of saying, as a private sector, which is justifiable, let me first make my money in terms of the high LSM group, and then whatever profits that I can, I will then look at the expansion and take that risk in terms of rural. Government is then saying we can actually then complement and come in at the deeper end, and then we can meet each other.
Thank you so much. I think that's a perfect place to pause this conversation. I can hear there's music coming from next door. I'm sure there's places you've all got to be to. But thank you so much to all of our panelists. You've been really generous with your time. I think the key lessons here are, again, it's just about bridging those divides and staying ahead rather than being sort of behind the curve that's going on in the rest of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.